They mocked me with slave movie quotes. I said nothing, then spoke in my native language. What happens when a mechanic, mocked for months with slave movie jokes, finally speaks up, but in a language they don't understand? What followed didn't just expose them, it froze the entire system in place. Jamal Okali started his morning the way people with a clean conscience but a sketchy credit history usually do, one foot in reality, one in resolve. He grabbed a cheap coffee from the corner shop where his name was always spelled wrong, sometimes Jamel, other times Jamal, once even Jamaican, threw on his work uniform that hugged too tight around the shoulders, and boarded the city bus that smelled like diesel, despair, and last night's fried regrets. He didn't ride that bus because he wanted to. He rode it because every dollar counted, and his old Honda had coughed its last breath 2 months ago. But Jamal didn't complain. He just gripped the metal pole, leaned back, and stared out the window like a man who'd learned a long time ago not to expect the road to ever straighten out. By 7:45 a.m., he was clocked in and walking into the belly of the dealership, not the glossy sales floor with its leather chairs and salesmen who smiled with their teeth, but the underbelly, the service bay, the place where the scent of motor oil, burnt rubber, and cynical jokes clung to every surface like mold. That morning, though, something shifted. Not in the sky, not in the work schedule, in him. Because when he stepped out of the garage to grab a delivery part, he noticed something. A small, almost sweet moment. A customer, older black woman, dressed in Sunday-style elegance despite it being Tuesday, smelling of soft perfume and powdered patience, had dropped her wallet as she got into a new Mercedes GLE. She didn't notice. No one else did either, except Jamal. He bent down, dusted it off, and walked it over to her. Didn't make a fuss, didn't clear his throat for attention, just handed it to her like dignity was still a thing in short supply but long memory. The woman blinked in surprise, looked him in the face for a full second. "Thank you, sweetheart. Men like you? Rare these days." Jamal nodded once. No words. Just the kind of nod that says, "I'm not looking for medals, just keeping balance in a crooked world." But he should have kept walking, because as he turned back toward the service bay, laughter broke out behind him. Well, well, look who's got manners. 12 years of mechanic, am I right? That was Trevor, the floor manager with shiny shoes and the soul of a sock puppet. Nah, man, I don't want to survive. I want to tighten that bolt. That was Matt from marketing, sipping from a mug that said, woke but wealthy. Real funny if your humor peaked in high school detention. The laughter hit like gravel to the back of the neck. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, mean, and soaked in that smug little confidence people get when they think human resources won't do a damn thing. Some of the workers nearby chuckled, not because it was funny, but because staying silent around racists in power is cheaper than unemployment. Others averted their eyes, retreating into the warm, reliable world of pretending it's not their fight. Jamal stood there, still, silent, like a statue carved from centuries of let it slide. Because the truth was, if he had opened his mouth, even to say something as mild as, "Excuse me," he'd be risking more than a job. He'd be risking rent, medical insurance, and his monthly Western Union wire to his aunt back in Kampala. The woman who raised him after malaria took his mother too soon. Here's the cruel part. The kinder you act, the faster the chains clang around your ankles. He'd helped. He'd stayed quiet. And somehow that made him a more appealing target. There's nothing more threatening to insecure men than a black man who doesn't flinch when provoked. The day rolled on, or tried to. At lunch, Jamal headed out back to the small concrete stoop behind the service bay. There, with his banana and a worn paperback of Ugandan proverbs in hand, he tried to find a slice of peace. And then came Trevor and Linda. Linda, the secretary with the spray tan of a rotisserie chicken and the attitude of someone who peaked in high school but never got the memo. "What you reading, Jamal? Not Roots, I hope. Or are you studying how to run off the plantation? Or maybe it's a cookbook," Linda snorted. "How to serve the customer. Literally, you got that hungry look in your eye." Their laughter echoed across the alley like broken car alarms. Annoying, useless, but hard to ignore. Jamal didn't say a word, closed his book, rested it gently beside him, took another bite of banana. Slow, deliberate. Not because he was afraid, because he understood something they never would. Silence, when chosen, is power. They strutted off like they'd scored points. He didn't chase the scoreboard. Alone again, Jamal picked up his book and found the proverb his grandmother used to say back in the village. Whenever he came home bruised from schoolyard taunts about his voice or his gait, "Amanyi gomuntu galabikamu kisira kiakizibu." A man's strength is revealed in hard times. He whispered it. Not for show, not for them, for himself. Later, while working under the chassis of an SUV that cost more than 2 years of his salary, a client came down. White guy, loud, chatty, brimming with that suburban boldness money tends to breed. Shook Jamal's hand like they were equals. Thanked him, then left. And then Matt once again. Whoa, soft hands for a slave, bro. What, you bathe in milk? The laughter that followed was ugly. And this time, it had teeth. Jamal paused, wiped his hands slowly on a rag. Not to clean, to think. Because by now it was obvious. This wasn't about jokes. This was about territory. They smelled in him something they couldn't understand. Pride without noise. Dignity without theatrics. And it rattled them. He could file a complaint, sure, with Trevor, the man leading the chorus, or maybe Mr. Clark, the regional director who once joked that Jamal must have learned about gasoline while huffing it behind a hut. That night, Jamal went home with aching shoulders and something heavier beneath his ribs. He hung up his uniform like a man hanging the day itself. Then he pulled out the wooden box he kept under his bed. Inside, old letters from his mother, a folded photo from his father's funeral, and a small battered Luganda English dictionary. Flipping through its creased pages, he found the word he needed, oquekalakasa. To resist, he wrote it down, tucked it into his pocket. The next day began with a company-wide diversity and inclusion training. The instructor was a white man in khakis who sounded like a wellness podcast. He droned on about openness and equity, quoting MLK like a sermon at a yoga retreat. By the end, he beamed, "The goal is to see each person as a unique individual." Trevor leaned over to Matt and muttered, "Yeah, like 12 unique individuals. In chains." Ha ha, same old soundtrack. But something clicked in Jamal's gut. Not anger, not pain, a decision. They weren't going to stop, not because they hated him, because they were certain they could. And he realized staying silent wasn't safety. It was surrender. And that was no longer on the table. Jamal O'Kali woke not to the harsh shriek of an alarm clock, but to a gut-punch realization. Not speaking up had stopped being an escape route and become a noose tightening around his neck. The silence that used to serve as a shield now felt like shackles. So he pulled on his work shirt, not because it was a uniform, but because he needed armor. Today would be different. Today he intended to meet his adversaries face to face, not as a battered mechanic, but as a man about to reclaim his own voice. He stepped onto the shop floor early, slipping through the already crowded service bay where the smell of oil and cynicism overlapped like a bad perfume. The daily gathering had begun, led by Trevor, who sipped almond milk latte as though it gave him moral high ground, cracking what he meant to be jokes. "Hey Jay, you show up before your plantation lets you off, or did they clock you in late again?" Laughter rippled, smug, hollow, and painfully consistent. You could almost chart racism's temperature by the volume of that chuckling echo. Jamal remained silent, but this time his quiet was intentional strategy, not avoidance. The buildup wasn't dramatic. It arrived quietly, a subtle but electric shift. At precisely 11:14 a.m., Mrs. Anderson walked into the showroom with her confident posture and platinum hair tucked around a face that said, "I own this place." She laid her palms gently on the hood of her Range Rover, explaining to the receptionist that someone who knows transmissions, preferably someone with European training, must look into its strange knocking noise. The receptionist, voice trembling, answered, "Actually, he's right here, ma'am. Jamal is our senior transmission technician." Her smile was apologetic and her tone begged forgiveness for existing. Jamal knew the meaning behind that look, the silent demand to confirm his worth. He could feel the oppressive gaze of her expectations. And then Matt stepped forward, grin wide and voice dripping with mock hospitality. "Mrs. Anderson, if you'd like, Jamal does come from the continent, just not that one. But he knows slave wagons better than anyone." The stolen laughter rang out, cruel and practiced. And then Jamal caught his breath and stepped forward without hesitation. He opened the SUV's hood and paused, silent for a moment, then spoke deliberately in Luganda. "Abantu abatawuliriza, bulikisira baba mubuzibu." Those who do not listen are always in trouble. The hush was immediate. Mrs. Anderson's face froze mid-bite of contempt. Matt's grin cracked. Trevor twitched, suddenly alert. "What are you mumbling?" Matt asked, voice brittle. "A proverb," Jamal replied evenly. "Those who do not listen are always in trouble." The insult slithered out, threatened to bite, but Jamal wasn't scared. He was steady. Trevor bristled, stepping forward. "Are you threatening the customer?" he challenged. "I spoke a proverb," Jamal said with calm dignity, "one from the language your theater of racism borrows so freely." He closed the hood, stepped back, and exited, not from fear, but from purpose. He headed back down to the service bay where the air smelled of honesty, even if it was thick with fumes. But that was just the first gust. The storm was building. 2 hours later, the summons came. Conference room now, white walls, white faces, and the unmistakable hush of corporate fear greased for performance. HR's Mrs. Ellis sat with a face puckered from holding back her own opinions, or maybe a mouthful of pepper. Regional Director Clark looked ready to ask Jamal to take his place, meaning somewhere far from any mic or meeting. Mr. O'Callaghan, Mrs. Ellis began in clipped tones, we've received a complaint about your behavior with a customer. Also, serious concern about your use of an unintelligible language, which staff perceived as threatening. So speaking my native language is threatening now? Jamal asked, hooded but sharp. We did not intend. Of course you didn't, he cut in. You never intend what ends up in your reports. Trevor, seated quietly in the corner, finger-combed his cuticles as if nervous claws might scratch truth out of the table. Given these complaints, we must initiate an internal investigation. You're suspended, effective immediately, unpaid until it concludes. Silence followed, heavy as engine oil. Mrs. Ellis waited for some break in the tension. Jamal offered none. For what, exactly? His voice held no malice, only incredulity that dignity was a crime. For not laughing at your jokes about my heritage? Violation of corporate ethics, Clark spat, and frankly, for provocative behavior. Jamal rose, steady and coldly measured. You know what really provokes me? He said, that I speak two languages. One you only hear in slave movies, and the other you pretend doesn't exist. Then he turned and walked out, past their stairs, past the empty calm of privilege, into the bay. He opened his locker, pulled out the same Luganda dictionary he'd carried since arrival, and finally pulled out his phone. Not to call his mother or aunt, not to beg or whine, to act. The next morning, two men walked into the service area, plus a reporter from the local paper and a lawyer. Mr. Lowry, the older gentleman whose Range Rover had been repaired, made no attempt to be incognito. He strode in, past rows of mechanics, escorted by the quiet authority of one who commands respect. He paused in front of Director Clark's office. A firm knock, and the door opened. Within 30 minutes, whispers flooded the bay like storm surge. Mr. Lowry was a retired diplomat who'd once lived in Kampala, fluent Luganda. He recognized Jamal's words, understood their intent, and was outraged at how they'd been twisted. To the reporter, he said calmly, it was a proverb, deeply cultural, not a threat. I heard respect in his tone, not hostility. And as an ex-diplomat, he'd submitted a formal letter to corporate headquarters demanding a review of their ethics guidelines. Meanwhile, the floor shifted beneath Trevor and Matt. The casual cruelty they'd worn like armor began to grate in quieter spaces. Some employees, like Joe in the tire bay, started whispering openly, pointing back to the toxic jokes. Is it really okay to joke about someone's skin like that? Matt slunk away. Linda's mouth stayed shut. No one laughed during lunch. And Jamal? He didn't gloat. He sat at a desk in the service office, drafting a letter, not a complaint, but a statement, layered with facts, cultural context, and unwavering dignity. He detailed how an engineer from Uganda with credentials, experience, and clear intent had been turned into a punchline. How silence can be a weapon, but not always enough. And occasionally you must speak, even in a language they don't understand, to make them hear. His words were precise, respectful, and devastatingly effective. This is the culmination. This is exactly what you've been waiting for. Stay tuned to see how he makes everyone answer for their roles. They thought it would blow over. They thought wrong. Jamal O'Callaghan's letter, composed with the cold precision of someone who knew the cost of every word, spread like wildfire across platforms it was never intended for. Someone, maybe Joe from Tires, maybe the new intern from HR, leaked it. But by the time anyone at the dealership figured it out, it was already echoing in community centers in Oakland and on office monitors in the corporate tower down in Texas. It wasn't written like a complaint. It wasn't a tantrum dressed up as a manifesto. No hashtags, no fists in the air. Just raw experience, mapped out with a mechanic's clarity. Direct, meticulous, undeniable. No tears, no pleading. Just truth. And Jamal's voice? It read like it sounded. Deep, measured, grounded like the roots of a baobab tree. Steady, unshakable. A voice that didn't demand sympathy. It commanded attention. He didn't beg, he reminded. And once that voice was out there, it did what no team of lawyers or spin doctors could undo. Things moved fast, like a VHS tape someone slammed into fast forward. First, Mr. Clark, the regional director, who'd once joked about Jamal's name belonging to a gas station, announced a family emergency leave. Word on the floor? He was asked to step down quietly. Miss Ellis, the HR director with a tone like cold soup, resigned. On her own terms. And Trevor? Trevor wasn't fired, not at first. They kept him. Let him stand in his own wreckage. Let him see how it felt when eyes that once avoided him now stared through him. Not with fear, but with exposed understanding. And in corporate America, being understood can be far more dangerous than being feared. Then came the call from the corporate office. A soft-voiced woman, trained in HR tact, offered Jamal a transfer, a promotion, a shiny new branch with what she called a leadership team that values cultural diversity. He declined. "I'm not your press release," Jamal said, voice cool. "I'm not here to be a symbol you put in brochures. I'm not a brand, I'm a man." There was silence on the line, not confusion, disbelief. They were used to folks grabbing any bone tossed their way. But Jamal was never a stray dog. He was a lion, one they'd tried to keep in a cage by calling him quiet. A week later, Jamal stood behind a podium at the local library. The room was packed, not with suits or reporters, but with students, young mechanics, community organizers, and neighbors who had heard the story and come not out of pity but respect. He wasn't there for claps. He was there because his people had been on mute too long. He read the letter out loud, every word, every pause, no frills, no performance, just him. And when he reached the final line, he looked up and said, "When you stay silent, they assume you agree. When you speak, they get nervous." Good. Nervous means they're listening. You could have heard a paperclip drop. The air was thick with something beyond agreement, acknowledgement. Then the applause started. Not the kind meant to flatter. The kind meant to say, "We see you." The turning point, though, came on a Tuesday so plain it could have disappeared in the calendar. Jamal was called into the dealership again, not to wrench bolts, not for a shift, to meet someone. He was greeted by a man in a tailored suit with the smooth face of someone who usually spoke to shareholders, not mechanics. One of the co-owners of the franchise, flown in from New York after what was officially dubbed a surprising public response. No cameras, no assistants, just him and Jamal in the office, where Trevor used to wink smugly from the corner. "I want your version," the man said. "Not the reports, yours." Jamal didn't react, didn't blink, just reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. It wasn't a resume. It was a Luganda proverb, printed in bold, with an English translation underneath. He slid it across the table. "This," Jamal said, "is all you need to understand. And if you don't, you'll never understand why your business is cracking at the seams." The man didn't argue. He nodded, slowly, too late for words. As Jamal exited the building, past the front counter, past the waiting lounge where he'd once been invisible, he saw a news van parked outside, a local station, cameras set up. They weren't lost. They were waiting. The reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "You're Jamal O'Kali, right?" He didn't puff his chest, didn't throw slogans. He just nodded with quiet strength. "That's me, the one who chose not to stay quiet. 12 minutes. That's how long the interview lasted." He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He simply laid out what months of mockery looked like from the inside. How casual racism wasn't loud, it was daily. How jokes could become chains. How a lone mechanic with no backing, no team, no handlers, brought a corporate culture to its knees using nothing more than truth, timing, and a language they refused to hear. And then he said, "I'm not a fighter. I'm a mechanic. But when an engine fails, you have to break it open. Sometimes with noise, sometimes without. Either way, you fix it, or the whole car rots." That quote, it aired and spread. It was clipped, captioned, reposted. It became quote of the week on community pages, then found its way to tech forums, university lectures, and boardroom icebreakers. That night, Jamal went home to his small apartment. The room didn't feel like much, but it was clean. His book of Luganda proverbs sat on the table beside a warm cup of ginger tea. The old dictionary rested next to it. He opened the back cover and wrote a new entry. Not a translation, a truth. "When they make you silent, speak in a language they don't understand. It'll echo louder than any shout." Was it the final act? It was the prologue. Because then the messages started coming. Not from companies, from people, students, night shift workers, entry-level interns, elders who'd gone through it all before and thought nothing would change. They'd been silent too, but now they were writing. And Jamal? He answered every single one. Some with encouragement, some with proverbs, some with just 3 words. "I see you, I hear you. Keep speaking."